The room was completely silent. 23 German soldiers sat on wooden benches, backs straight, despite the exhaustion that lived in their bones, despite the hunger that had hollowed them out from the inside. They sat the way soldiers sit when sitting is an order, when sitting is all that's left. The benches were old Wehrmacht issue, the kind that had held thousands of men before them. The wood was worn smooth by all those bodies, all those wars, all those years. Now it held 23 men who had stopped being soldiers 3 days ago but didn't know yet what they were instead. Sergeant Leopold Adler sat fifth from the left. 35 years old, 2 years on the Eastern Front, 6 months in retreat across a country that no longer recognized itself. 3 days as a prisoner of war. His uniform was filthy, his face was gaunt, his eyes held that particular emptiness that comes when a man has seen too much and felt too little for too long. He stared at the door. They had been told food was coming. The guard who'd brought them here had said it in broken German, the kind you learn from prisoners, from necessity, from war. Food is coming, he'd said. Sit. Wait. Leopold didn't believe him. From experience, food for prisoners meant thin soup, the kind you could see through if you held it up to the light, hard bread that could break teeth. If you were lucky, if the guards were feeling generous or simply bored, maybe a single potato. Small, mostly rotten, but still a potato. They had learned not to expect anything more. Expectations were dangerous things. They created space for disappointment, and disappointment could break a man faster than bullets. The light in the room was grey. It came through windows set high in the walls, the kind designed to let in air but not hope. April light, weak, uncertain, the kind of light that couldn't decide if it was still winter or finally spring. Leopold shifted slightly on the bench. His stomach growled. A sound so loud in the silence that the man next to him glanced over. Leopold didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the door. 3 days since surrender. The memory was still fresh. A ruined farmhouse somewhere in what used to be Germany. His unit had been pulling back for months, always moving west, always running. Running from the Soviets. Running from reality. Running out of everything that mattered, ammunition, food, hope. When the Canadian patrol had surrounded their position, Leopold had simply raised his hands. His men had done the same. None of them had the will to fight anymore. The will had leaked out somewhere between Stalingrad and here. Between believing and knowing better, he had thought he would be shot. It happened sometimes in the chaos of those final weeks, not often, but often enough that the possibility lived in every soldier's mind like a dark prayer. Please let it be quick. Please let it mean something. Please let it just be over. Instead, a Canadian corporal had searched them for weapons, professional, thorough, no anger in his movements, no hatred in his eyes, just the mechanical efficiency of a man doing a job he'd done too many times before. Then the corporal had pointed to a truck and told them in that broken German to get in. No shouting, no threats, no violence, just calm, professional work. The truck had brought them here, to this former German barracks that the Canadians were now using as a holding center. They'd been searched again. More carefully this time, their names written down, photographs taken, numbers assigned, everything done by the rules. The same rules Leopold himself had learned when he was still a soldier who took prisoners instead of becoming one. Then they'd been brought to this room, told to sit, told food was coming. That had been 30 minutes ago. 30? Leopold didn't believe it because 30 minutes was too soon. Prisoners weren't fed quickly. You waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. You learned very quickly that as a prisoner, you mattered very little. Feeding you was never urgent, never important. You were fed when it was convenient, when supplies allowed, when someone remembered you existed. So when the guard had said food was coming, Leopold had nodded, had prepared himself to sit there for hours, maybe longer, had settled into the familiar rhythm of waiting that every soldier knows. The slow erosion of minutes into hours, into days, into nothing. That was why the sound of footsteps in the hallway made every man in the room tense. The door handle turned. Leopold's heart did something strange in his chest, something it hadn't done in years. It hoped. He hated it immediately. Hope was more dangerous than disappointment. Hope could kill you from the inside out, make you believe in things that weren't real, make you forget what the world actually was. The door opened. 3 Canadian soldiers walked in. They were carrying trays, not small trays, not the kind you balance in one hand while you unlock doors with the other. Big metal trays, the industrial kind used to feed groups of men, the kind that meant someone had spent time preparing something that mattered. And on those trays was food. The smell hit Leopold first. Meat. Real meat. Cooked meat. Not the ersatz rations they'd been choking down for months. Not the mystery substance that claimed to be protein but tasted like despair mixed with sawdust. Actual meat. Roasted. Seasoned. The smell of it rolled across the room like a wave, like a memory of a life that used to exist, like something from before. Leopold's mouth watered involuntarily. His stomach clenched, a physical reaction he couldn't control. His body recognizing something his mind refused to believe. The Canadians placed the trays on a long table at the front of the room. Nobody moved. 23 pairs of eyes fixed on those trays, on the food arranged there with what looked almost like care. Looked almost like someone had tried. Leopold could see it all from where he sat. Large pieces of roasted meat, browned and glistening, mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, pooling in little golden lakes. Cooked vegetables, carrots and peas still steaming. Several loaves of bread already sliced, the kind that was soft instead of the hard bricks they'd been forcing down their throats for months. This couldn't be real. This had to be a trick, a test, some kind of psychological game the Canadians were playing. Take photographs of the prisoners with food to show the world how well they treated captured Germans, then take the food away, laugh about the looks on their faces. One of the Canadian soldiers stepped forward. He was older than the other 2, maybe 42, 43. A corporal, Leopold could tell from the stripes, even though the uniform was foreign. He had a tired face, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from seeing too much for too long. Red-tinged hair suggested Scottish heritage, pale skin weathered by years outdoors. But his eyes were calm, not cruel, not cold, just calm. Later, Leopold would learn his name was Callum Fraser, but in this moment, he was simply the corporal, the man with tired eyes who was about to change everything. Fraser spoke in English. Leopold didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, matter of fact, almost gentle, like speaking to children who were afraid of something that couldn't hurt them. Another soldier stepped forward, younger. He translated into simple German. The kind you speak to, make sure nothing is lost in the crossing between languages. This is your meal, the translator said. There is enough for everyone. Form a line, take what you want, eat until you are full. The silence in the room changed quality. Before it had been the silence of waiting, of men who had learned to wait. Now it was the silence of disbelief, of 23 minds trying to process words that made no sense. Take what you want. Eat until you are full. Those words belonged to another life, a life before the war, before the rationing and the hunger and the slow starvation that had become so normal they'd almost forgotten what full felt like. You didn't take what you wanted, you took what you were given. You didn't eat until you were full, you ate what kept you alive and tried not to think about being hungry. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Leopold looked around at the others. He saw the same confusion on every face, the same war between hunger and disbelief, the same desperate, dangerous hope trying to take root. Fraser seemed to understand why no one was moving. He spoke again. The translator repeated it. "This is not a trick. This is normal. This is the same food we give our own soldiers. You are prisoners, yes, but you are still human. Now eat." Still, nobody moved. The same food they gave their own soldiers, not similar, not comparable, the same, identical. The Canadians ate like this, every day. This was normal for them. Leopold felt something crack inside his chest, some piece of the world he'd been carrying that couldn't bear the weight of this information. If they ate like this, if they'd always eaten like this, while German soldiers had been starving on rations that barely qualified as food, while the Wehrmacht supply system had collapsed and men had been eating anything they could scavenge just to keep moving. If the enemy had been eating like this the whole time, what did that mean? Slowly, like men waking from a dream they weren't sure they wanted to leave, one prisoner stood up. Then another. They formed a line, because that's what soldiers do, even defeated soldiers, even starving soldiers. They understand lines. The first man reached the table and stopped. His hands hovered over the food, uncertain, like touching it might make it disappear, might reveal the trick, might break whatever spell was allowing this to happen. Fraser made a small gesture, gentle, encouraging, his weathered face showing something that looked almost like patience, almost like kindness. "Go ahead, son." The German soldier took a plate. He was young, Leopold realized, maybe 23 at most, barely old enough to remember what peace felt like. His fingers trembled as they closed around the ceramic edge. The young soldier began to fill his plate, moving like someone who expected to be stopped at any second, expected a hand to come down on his shoulder, expected the voice that would say, "Stop, enough, too much, that's not for you." But no hand came down. No voice said stop. He took meat, a piece larger than anything Leopold had seen in a year. He added potatoes, a scoop so generous it spilled over the edge of the plate. Vegetables, bread. When his plate was full, he looked at Fraser. His eyes asked a question his voice couldn't form. "Is this really mine?" Fraser nodded. "Go sit, eat." The young soldier walked back to his bench, sat down, stared at his plate like it was a letter from God, written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. The line moved forward. One by one, the prisoners filled their plates, each one going through the same ritual of disbelief, the same tentative reaching, the same moment of waiting for permission that came without asking. Leopold was fifth in line. He watched each man ahead of him, watched them take food like they were stealing hope, watched them carry their plates back to the benches with the careful reverence of men handling something sacred. By the time Leopold reached the trays, his stomach was making sounds that embarrassed him, loud, insistent growls that belonged in an animal, not a man, but he couldn't stop them, couldn't control the way his body responded to the proximity of real food. He hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks, months, if he was being honest with himself. The Wehrmacht supply system had collapsed completely. Rations had dwindled to almost nothing. He'd been surviving on whatever could be scavenged, often going days with just hard bread and water. Sometimes not even that. He took a plate. His grip was unsteady despite his best efforts. 35 years old, a sergeant, 2 years on the Eastern Front, and he couldn't control the slight quiver in his fingers. He tried to steady himself, tried to maintain some dignity. But hunger is a powerful thing. It strips away pretense, reduces a man to the animal underneath. He put meat on his plate. The portion was larger than anything he'd seen in a year, maybe 2 years. He could smell it, the richness of it, the reality of it. He added mashed potatoes with their golden pools of butter. real vegetables that still held their color, bread that compressed when he touched it, the way bread was supposed to behave. He had to stop himself from taking too much. Some part of his brain was still operating on scarcity logic, still trying to leave enough for others, even though there was clearly plenty, even though the trays were still full. His plate grew heavy in his grasp, heavy with food, heavy with the weight of what this meant. He walked back to his bench, sat down, looked at his plate, looked around the room at the other men, all sitting now, all staring at their food with the same expression, incomprehension. Then someone started eating. Leopold didn't see who. Didn't matter. The sound of it broke whatever spell had been holding them frozen, the click of metal on ceramic, the sound of a man taking his first bite. And then everyone was eating. The room filled with sounds Leopold had almost forgotten existed. The quiet sounds of chewing, the scrape of forks, the occasional involuntary noise that comes when starving men encounter real food. Leopold cut a piece of meat, put it in his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue. It was seasoned, actually seasoned, salt and herbs and something else he couldn't identify but recognized as care. Someone had cooked this, had tried, had made it taste good. It was tender. It gave way under his teeth without resistance. The texture of meat that had been cooked properly, with time, with attention. He chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying to process the fact that this was happening, that this was real. He swallowed, took another bite, and another. The potatoes were creamy and rich, the vegetables were cooked perfectly, still with some texture, not the grey mush that came from cooking them too long, or from cans that had sat too long in storage. The bread was soft and fresh. When he bit into it, it compressed and sprang back. The way bread had behaved before the war. Halfway through the meal, Leopold started crying. He couldn't help it, couldn't stop it. The tears just came, rolling down his face as he continued to eat, as he kept putting food in his mouth even as his vision blurred. He wasn't alone. Around the room, other men were crying too, not sobbing, not breaking down. Just silent tears streaming down dirty faces as they ate the first real meal they'd had in longer than they could remember. Tears of relief, tears of confusion, tears of gratitude they didn't know how to express and weren't sure they should feel toward their captors. Tears that came from somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere the body kept score of every hunger, every deprivation, every lie they'd been told about how the world worked. The Canadian soldiers watched all of this in silence. They didn't comment, didn't mock, didn't treat the crying men like they were weak or broken or pathetic. They just stood there, maintaining a respectful distance, making sure there was enough food, ready to bring more if needed. When the first man finished his plate and looked uncertainly at the trays where food still remained, Fraser spoke again. "If you're still hungry, you can have more. There's plenty." The man went back, got more. Others followed. One young soldier, who looked barely old enough to shave, ate 3 full portions, his body desperately trying to compensate for months of starvation, trying to store calories against the next famine, against the moment when this ended and hunger returned. The Canadians didn't stop him. They just brought out more food, ensured the supply didn't run out. After everyone had eaten, after the plates were cleared and the room had settled into the quiet that comes after hunger is satisfied, Fraser spoke one more time. The translator rendered his words into careful German. "Tomorrow you'll be moved to a permanent prisoner camp. The food there will be the same as what you ate today, 3 meals a day. Full portions. This is how we do things. This is what you can expect for the duration of your imprisonment." Leopold sat on his bench and tried to breathe. 3 meals a day, full portions every day for the duration. This wasn't temporary, this wasn't a photograph, this wasn't a trick. This was policy. This was how they did things. Fraser and the other Canadians left, taking the empty trays with them, leaving the prisoners alone in the room with their full stomachs and their breaking worldviews. Leopold didn't sleep that night. None of them did. They talked instead. Quiet conversations in the dark, processing what had happened, trying to fit it into their understanding of the world, trying to make it make sense. They'd been fed, actually fed, not given starvation rations, not given the minimum needed to technically keep them alive. They'd been given the same food, the same portions as Canadian soldiers ate. Their captors had fed them like human beings. This single act, this simple provision of adequate food, created a cognitive dissonance that Leopold knew would take days, weeks, maybe months to fully process, because he knew what the Third Reich had done. He knew how Germany treated prisoners. He'd seen it on the Eastern Front, the starvation, the brutality, the systematic dehumanization. He'd expected on some level to receive the same treatment in return. The logic of reciprocal cruelty made sense to him. It fit the pattern of the war they'd been fighting. But this generosity from an enemy they'd fought for years, this didn't make sense. And it was precisely this lack of sense, this violation of expected patterns, that made it so powerful. Leopold lay on his assigned cot in the barracks, stared at the ceiling, felt the unfamiliar sensation of a full stomach, felt the even stranger sensation of doubt. What if everything they'd been told was a lie? What if the enemy wasn't who they'd been taught to believe? What if strength looked different than they'd imagined? What if kindness wasn't weakness? What if they'd been fighting for the wrong things all along? The questions came in the dark. Relentless. Unavoidable. Questions that couldn't be asked in daylight. Questions that soldiers weren't supposed to ask. But Leopold was starting to realize he wasn't a soldier anymore. He didn't know what he was. But the meal had changed something, had planted something, a seed of doubt that would grow in the coming days, in the coming weeks, until it became too large to ignore. They'd been fed by the enemy, like humans, like they mattered. And nothing in Leopold's 35 years had prepared him for what that meant. The second day began with disbelief. Leopold woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The same footsteps as yesterday, the same rhythm, the same purposeful march of men carrying something heavy. He sat up on his cot. Around him, the other 22 prisoners were doing the same, moving slowly, bodies stiff from sleeping on thin mattresses that were still better than the ground they'd been sleeping on for months. The door opened. The same Canadian soldiers, the same trays, the same smell of real food. Breakfast. Leopold stared. Thick oatmeal with actual sugar and milk. Not the watery gruel they'd choked down in the Wehrmacht. Eggs that had come from actual chickens, not powder. Bread with jam. Coffee that smelled like coffee, not the grain-based ersatz they'd been pretending was coffee for years. Fraser was there again, the corporal with the tired face and calm eyes. He nodded at the prisoners. "Breakfast," he said simply. They ate. Leopold watched the young soldier, the one who'd been first in line yesterday. He was eating more slowly today, less frantically. Like some part of him was starting to believe the food would keep coming, starting to trust. Trust was dangerous. The third day, the food came again. And the fourth. And the fifth. By the seventh day, Leopold's body was beginning to change. He could feel it. The constant gnawing emptiness in his stomach was fading. His pants fit differently, less loose around the waist. His face, when he caught his reflection in the metal sink in the washroom, looked less skeletal. Color was returning to skin that had been grey for months. He was gaining weight. They all were. Men who'd been walking skeletons were beginning to look human again, ribs becoming less visible, cheeks filling out, eyes losing that hollow, haunted quality that came from prolonged starvation. By the 14th day, Leopold felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Energy, real energy, not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled energy of combat, not the frantic energy of running for your life, but the steady, sustainable energy that comes when a body has what it needs. When it's not slowly consuming itself to stay alive. It terrified him, because with the energy came guilt. The letters had started arriving on day 10. Mail from home, the Red Cross, had processed their information. Families now knew they were alive. Imprisoned, but alive. Leopold's wife had written immediately. He held the letter carefully, read it 3 times before he could process what it was telling him. The words were measured. His wife knew letters were read by sensors. But the message was clear enough. Berlin was starving. The bombing had destroyed the supply lines. What food existed went to the soldiers still fighting. What little remained went to children. Adults were surviving on less than 800 calories a day. His wife had sold her wedding ring for a loaf of bread. His mother was too weak to leave the apartment. They were starving. And Leopold was eating 3 full meals a day, growing stronger, gaining weight, safe behind Canadian wire while his family withered. The guilt sat in his stomach, heavier than any meal. He wasn't alone in this. Around the barracks at night, he heard other men crying quietly, reading letters from wives, mothers, children describing conditions that got worse with every week. The contrast was unbearable. They were prisoners. They'd lost. Their country was being destroyed. And they were being fed better than they'd been fed as soldiers, better than their families were being fed, better in some cases than they'd been fed in peacetime. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. On day 17, Leopold was assigned to a work detail, garden duty. They were planting vegetables in what had once been a Wehrmacht vegetable garden. The Canadians were using it now, growing food for the camp. Prisoners provided the labor. Leopold didn't mind. The work was honest, simple, digging in soil, planting seeds. Physical labor that gave him something to do besides think. The weather was warming. Spring was finally arriving. The kind of spring that felt like a promise after a long winter, even if you knew the promise might be a lie. Corporal Fraser supervised the detail. This was the first time Leopold had worked directly under him, had time to observe him beyond those brief moments in the mess hall. Fraser was maybe 42, 43. The red tint in his hair and pale skin confirmed the Scottish heritage Leopold had guessed. He carried himself like a soldier who'd been a soldier for a long time, long enough that military bearing was just how he stood, how he moved, how he existed, but his eyes were kind. Leopold hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected to see kindness in the eyes of a man who'd spent years fighting Germans, who'd probably lost friends to German bullets, maybe brothers, maybe more. Fraser watched the prisoners work, didn't rush them, didn't shout, just stood there with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried. Around midday, the sun grew hot. Leopold was sweating through his shirt. His hands were covered in dirt, blisters forming on palms that had grown soft during the retreat, during the weeks of not doing anything but running and hiding and trying to stay alive. Fraser called a break. Water, he said in English, then repeated in halting German. Trinken. One of the other guards brought out a container, cups, fresh water. Leopold drank. The water was cold, clean. It tasted like nothing and everything, like the absence of thirst. Fraser was watching him. Their eyes met across the garden, a moment of connection between men who should have been enemies, who maybe still were, who definitely weren't friends, but something passed between them anyway, some recognition. Soldier to soldier, man to man. Fraser looked away first. On day 23, something happened that would stay with Leopold for the rest of his life. It was dinner, the evening meal. The prisoners had been moved to their permanent camp 3 days earlier, a larger facility, more organized. But the food had remained exactly the same. 3 meals, full portions, every single day. Leopold was beginning to believe it might continue. A young prisoner named Dieter sat next to Leopold in the mess hall, 19 years old, Hitler Youth, full of ideology and certainty and all the things young men are full of before the world teaches them better. Dieter ate his first plate quickly, hungrily. Then he looked at the serving line where food still remained. He hesitated. Leopold watched him struggle with it. The scarcity logic. The fear of taking too much. The certainty that resources were limited and taking more meant someone else got less. Dieter stood up, walked back to the line. He filled his plate again. A second full portion. Sat back down. Ate it all. Then he went back a third time. Leopold's breath caught. Surely this would be where it stopped. Surely this was where the Canadians would say, no, enough. Too much. You're being greedy. You're taking more than your share. But the Canadian soldier serving food just smiled. Hungry, are you? He said in English. Dieter didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the gentle teasing, the permission implicit in the smile. He filled his plate a third time. The Canadian soldier brought out more food, ensuring the supply didn't run out. Dieter ate all 3 portions, his 19-year-old body desperately trying to recover, trying to store calories against future famine, against the next hunger that his nervous system was certain would come. The Canadians never said stop. They just kept bringing food. Leopold felt something break inside him, some last defense against the truth, some final wall between what he'd been taught and what he was experiencing. They weren't just feeding prisoners adequately, they were encouraging them to eat, to be full, to take care of their bodies, like they mattered, like their hunger mattered, like they were human beings whose needs were worth meeting. That night, Leopold couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't from hunger or fear or the strangeness of captivity. It was from questions, questions that wouldn't stop coming, questions that threatened everything he thought he knew. If the enemy could do this, if they could feed prisoners not just adequately, but generously, if they could maintain their humanity even toward men who'd been trying to kill them. What did that say about the side he'd fought for? What did that say about strength? What did that say about civilization? 6 months passed. The pattern held. 3 meals a day, full portions, work details that followed Geneva Convention guidelines, medical care when needed, mail from home when it could get through, recreation time, books, some semblance of normal human existence within the confines of imprisonment. Leopold's body had fully recovered. He looked like he had before the war, maybe better. The hollows were gone from his cheeks, the skeletal quality erased. He was strong again, healthy. The guilt had become a permanent resident in his chest, but alongside it, something else was growing, a question that had taken root that first night and had been growing ever since. One afternoon in the garden, Leopold found himself working near Fraser again. The corporal was supervising as usual, patient, calm, present in that way some people are present, fully there, not thinking about somewhere else, not wishing he was doing something else. Leopold's hands moved through the soil, planting, covering, patting down. The repetitive rhythm of it, almost meditative. He spoke without planning to. "Why do you feed us so well?" The words came out in German. He wasn't even sure Fraser would understand. Fraser stopped, looked at him, a long, measuring look. Then he answered in slow, careful English, knowing Leopold had picked up enough to understand, knowing the question deserved a real answer. "Because you're hungry," Fraser said simply. "We have food. Seems pretty simple." Leopold shook his head. "But we're your enemies. We killed your men." Fraser's face did something complicated. Grief passed through his eyes like a shadow. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. True, and you lost. The war's over. You're prisoners now, not enemies. He paused, then added something that would echo in Leopold's mind for decades. We don't starve prisoners. That's not who we are. The Russians do. We're not Russians. Fraser looked out across the garden, at the neat rows of vegetables beginning to sprout, at the prisoners working in the spring sun, at the world rebuilding itself one planted seed at a time. Look, he said, I don't know what you believed about us, what they told you, but we're not what you think. We don't hate you. We hated what you were doing, what your country was doing, but you personally? He gestured at Leopold. You're just a soldier who was following orders. Now you're a prisoner following different orders.
Well, he met Leopold's eyes. That doesn't make you subhuman, just makes you human in different circumstances. Leopold stood there with his hands in the dirt, with soil under his fingernails and the spring sun on his face, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't weakness, this kindness, this humanity extended across battle lines. This was strength, real strength. The strength to maintain your values when maintaining them was expensive.
When it would be easier not to, when reciprocal cruelty would make perfect sense. That conversation stayed with Leopold, lived in him, changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. Unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers. In English first, then German. Clinical, matter of fact. Like announcing the weather, like announcing anything mundane and expected. But there was nothing mundane about it. The Third Reich was gone, destroyed. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd believed in, everything they'd been told was inevitable and necessary and right. Gone. In the barracks that night, men wept, some from relief, some from grief, some from the complicated mixture of both that comes when something you've invested everything in collapses completely. Leopold felt numb. His country was defeated, occupied, divided. Everything he'd known was ending. His family was still starving in a city that had been bombed into rubble. His future was uncertain in ways that made uncertainty seem too small a word. But he was safe, fed, alive. The guilt was overwhelming. The next morning he woke expecting something to change. The war was over. The strategic reason for treating prisoners well, if there'd ever been one, was gone. There was no reason to encourage German soldiers to surrender anymore. No tactical advantage to reputation. Surely now the food would decrease, the portions would shrink. They'd be fed adequately, maybe, by Geneva Convention standards, but not generously, not like this. Breakfast came, the same portions, the same quality, oatmeal and eggs and fresh bread and real coffee. Lunch came, soup thick with meat and vegetables, cheese, bread that still had softness to it. Dinner came, a full hot meal, roasted protein with sides of potatoes and greens. Portions that would have been generous in peacetime. Nothing had changed. Leopold stared at his plate, at the food that kept coming. That had never stopped. That apparently wasn't going to stop. That evening, Fraser was supervising the mess hall. Leopold approached him, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain about whether it was allowed to speak. 6 months of consistent kindness had eroded those fears. "The war is over," Leopold said. Fraser nodded. "It is, but you still feed us the same." "We do." "Why?" Fraser smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who'd seen too much, but somehow maintained something essential anyway. "Because it was never about the war, Adler," he said, using Leopold's name for the first time. "It was never about strategy or tactics or what made military sense." He gestured around the mess hall, at the prisoners eating, at the Canadian soldiers serving food, at the mundane miracle of it. It's about who we are, what we believe people deserve, war or no war, win or lose. We maintain our values because they're our values, and not because they're convenient, not because they're easy, because they're who we've decided to be. He met Leopold's eyes. You're still human beings. War being over doesn't change that. Leopold felt something crack open in his chest. Some final defense, some last resistance to the truth. They weren't maintaining standards for strategic reasons. They'd never been. This wasn't pragmatism dressed up as kindness. This wasn't calculated generosity designed to achieve a goal. This was simply who they were, even when it cost them, even when it would have been easier to do less, even when the recipients were men who'd fought against them for years. They maintained their humanity because that's what civilization meant to them. Values that didn't change with circumstances, principles that held even under pressure, especially under pressure. That night, Leopold lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the Eastern Front, about what he'd seen there, what his country had done, the deliberate starvation of prisoners, the systematic brutality, the ideology that said some people weren't fully human and therefore didn't deserve to be treated as such. He thought about the Canadians, about food that kept coming, about kindness that didn't waver, about values that held. He thought about strength, real strength, the strength to be better than your enemies, to refuse to become what you're fighting against. And he understood, finally, why Germany had lost. Not because of strategy or resources or military might, but because of this fundamental difference in understanding what it meant to be strong, what it meant to be civilized, what it meant to maintain your humanity when everything pushed you to abandon it. The Canadians had won by being better people, by refusing to let the war change who they were, by feeding their prisoners when they could have starved them, by maintaining dignity when cruelty would have been easier, by showing that values mattered, that how you treated the defeated said everything about whether you deserved to win. Leopold closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more guilt, more processing of a world that had collapsed and was trying to rebuild itself from the rubble. But tonight he understood something essential. He'd been on the wrong side, not because of tactics or politics or military outcomes, but because his side had forgotten what the Canadians still knew, that how you treat your enemies when you have the power to treat them however you want. That's the measure of who you really are. And that meal, that first meal, 6 months ago, had been teaching him that lesson every single day since, 3 times a day, every single day, until he finally learned it. The months became a year, then 18 months. Leopold Adler remained a prisoner. The barbed wire remained. The guards remained. The daily roll calls and the work details and the restrictions on movement. All of it remained, but so did the food. 3 meals a day, full portions every single day. By the spring of 1947, Leopold had been in Canadian custody for 2 years. 2 years of adequate nutrition, 2 years of safety, 2 years of living better than he'd lived as a soldier fighting for the Reich. The guilt had evolved into something else, something more complicated, a kind of grief mixed with understanding, a mourning for the man he'd been, for the beliefs he'd carried, for the country that had sent him to war and then had nothing to offer when he came back. Because prisoners were going home now, slowly. The repatriation had begun. Men were being processed, screened, categorized. Some went quickly. Young men with clean records, men who'd been conscripted, not volunteers, men the Allies decided posed no threat. Others waited, officers, party members, anyone with connections to the regime's inner workings. Leopold was somewhere in the middle, a sergeant, not high enough to matter politically, not low enough to go immediately. He waited his turn, and while he waited, the food continued. On a cool evening in April, Leopold was working late in the garden. The vegetables needed planting before the season got away from them. He'd volunteered to stay. The work gave him purpose, something to do besides think. Fraser was there too, supervising, as always. Though supervising was perhaps the wrong word. After 2 years, it felt more like companionship, like two men working the same soil toward the same goal. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a world that had just torn itself apart. Leopold finished his row, stood, stretched his back, felt the good ache of physical labor, the kind of tired that comes from doing something productive instead of destructive. Fraser was sitting on a wooden crate, smoking a cigarette, watching the sunset with the expression of a man who'd learned to appreciate small beauties because the large ones had all been destroyed. "Adler," he said. Leopold turned. "I heard you're scheduled to go home next week." Leopold nodded. "Yes, the 7th. Fraser took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. The smoke drifted away on the evening breeze. 2 years, he said. Long time. Yes. They stood in comfortable silence. Two men who'd spent enough time in each other's presence that silence wasn't awkward, was just space for thought. Fraser stubbed out his cigarette, looked at Leopold directly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did it change you, being here, the way we treated you?" Leopold considered the question. It deserved honesty. "Yes," he said finally. "More than you know, more than I knew for a long time." "How?" Leopold looked out at the garden, at the neat rows they'd planted together over 2 springs, at the vegetables growing in soil that had once grown food for Wehrmacht soldiers, at the way life persisted in rebuilding itself no matter what humans did to each other. "You showed me what I believed about strength was wrong," he said. "I thought strength was hardness, cruelty, the willingness to do whatever it takes without mercy or hesitation." He paused, finding the words. "But you showed me that real strength is maintaining your values when it would be easier not to. That being kind to your enemies doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger than they could ever be." Fraser was quiet for a long moment. "You changed my mind by feeding me," Leopold continued, "by treating me like I was still human when I expected to be treated like I was less than human, by being better than everything I'd been taught you were." He met Fraser's eyes. "You won the war because of this. Not just because of tanks and planes and soldiers, but because of this, because you maintained your humanity, because you refused to become what you were fighting." Fraser's weathered face showed something that might have been satisfaction, might have been sadness, might have been both. "We tried," he said simply. "Didn't always succeed, made mistakes, but we tried."
"You succeeded with me." Fraser stood, extended his hand. Leopold took it. They shook. Former enemies, not quite friends, something else, something the old language of war didn't have words for. "Good luck out there, Adler," Fraser said. "Germany's in rough shape. It's going to be hard." "I know. But you're stronger than you were when you came here. You'll manage." Leopold nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The 7th of May, 1947, exactly 2 years after Germany's surrender, Leopold Adler walked out of the Canadian prisoner camp a free man. Free was a complicated word. He had papers, documentation, a ticket for a train that would take him through France, through Belgium, back into what remained of Germany, back to Berlin, back to a wife he hadn't seen in 2 years and a city he knew only from letters that described ruins and hunger and chaos. He carried one small bag, everything he owned in the world. Some clothes the Canadians had given him, a few personal items, letters from his wife, and something else he couldn't quite name, a change that had happened inside him, a transformation that had no physical weight but felt heavier than anything in the bag. The train journey took 3 days. Leopold watched Europe pass by the windows,
saw the destruction firsthand instead of hearing about it in reports. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, countryside scarred. The evidence of total war written across the landscape in a language everyone could read. He crossed into Germany. The devastation intensified. This was the heart of it, the place where the war had ended, where the final battles had been fought, where the bill for 12 years of madness had come due all at once. Berlin appeared through the train window like a nightmare made solid. Leopold had known it would be bad. The letters had prepared him. But knowing and seeing were different things. Whole city blocks were gone, just gone, reduced to rubble and dust and the ghosts of what had been. Buildings stood as hollow shells, windows empty, walls missing, roofs collapsed. People moved through the ruins like shadows, thin, grey, haunted. The train station was damaged but functioning. Barely, Leopold got off, stood on the platform, breathed air that smelled like dust and despair, and the slow decay of everything familiar. A woman was standing near the exit, thin, so thin, wearing a coat that had been mended multiple times, grey streaks in hair that had been blonde, lines in a face that had been young. His wife, she saw him. Their eyes met across the platform. She didn't run to him, didn't cry out, just stood there, conserving energy, conserving everything because everything was scarce. Leopold walked to her. They embraced. She felt like bones wrapped in skin, wrapped in clothing, like she might break if he held too tight. "You're alive," she whispered. "So are you." They walked home, through streets Leopold didn't recognize, past buildings that weren't there anymore, past people who looked like they were already dead, but their bodies hadn't figured it out yet. His apartment building was still standing, damaged, but standing. They climbed the stairs. No electricity, no lights, just the dim illumination from windows that had been covered with cardboard instead of glass. Inside, the apartment was cold, nearly empty. Everything that could be sold or traded for food had been sold or traded. Furniture gone, decorations gone, books gone, everything except the absolute essentials. His mother was there, 73 years old, sitting in a chair that was one of the few pieces left. She looked like a skeleton pretending to be alive. Her hands shook, her eyes were sunken. When she stood to embrace him, she moved like every movement hurt. They sat, what remained of a family, what had survived. His wife brought him dinner. The word was almost obscene. Dinner implied food. What she brought was a mockery of the concept. A thin soup that was mostly water. A small piece of bread so hard it could have been used as a weapon. That was it. That was dinner for 3 people. Leopold stared at the bowl in front of him. He'd just come from a place where breakfast alone had been more food than this, where 3 meals a day had been substantial, where going back for seconds had been encouraged, where he'd gained weight, where his body had healed. He'd been a prisoner, defeated, captured, controlled, and he'd eaten better than free people in his own capital city. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. "This is all?" he asked quietly. His wife nodded. "The rations are 800 calories a day. If we're lucky, sometimes less. Sometimes the distribution centers have nothing." 800 calories. The Canadian camp had been feeding him close to 3,000.
"How long?" he asked. "Since the surrender, it's gotten worse, not better. The Allies control the food supply. They send some, not enough, never enough." Leopold looked at his mother, at the way her hands trembled holding the empty bowl, at the grey pallor of her skin, at the way her clothes hung on a body that had consumed its own muscle and fat trying to stay alive. She was starving. They were all starving. And he had been safe, fed, growing stronger while they'd been dying by degrees.
"I'm sorry," he said. The words were inadequate, meaningless, but they were all he had. His wife reached across the table, took his hand. Hers was cold, bony. "You're alive," she said again. "That's enough. You're here. You're alive. We're still here. We survived." But had they? Leopold looked at them and wondered what survival meant when it looked like this, when it felt like this. That night, Leopold couldn't sleep. He lay next to his wife in their bed, felt the sharpness of her bones through her nightdress, heard her breathing, shallow, labored, the breathing of a body working too hard with too little fuel. He thought about the camp, about 3 meals a day, about Fraser bringing water on hot afternoons, about the young prisoner Dieter eating 3 full plates and being encouraged to eat more. He thought about values, about civilization, about what it meant to be strong. The Canadians had fed their enemies, had maintained human dignity for men who'd fought against them, had refused to let victory turn them cruel. And Germany, his Germany, was letting its own people starve, was broken and occupied and unable or unwilling to care for those who'd survived its madness. The contrast was unbearable. In the morning he went out, walked the ruined streets, talked to neighbors, other veterans who'd come home, people who'd never left. Everyone had the same story: hunger, cold, desperation. The daily struggle to find enough food to make it to the next day, the slow erosion of hope, the realization that winning or losing didn't matter because everyone had lost. Leopold found himself talking about the camp, about the food, about how prisoners had been treated. People didn't believe him at first. "They fed you that well?" an old veteran asked. "The Canadians?" 3 meals a day, full portions, the same food their own soldiers ate. "Propaganda," someone muttered. "No," Leopold said. "I lived it for 2 years, every single day, even after the war ended, even when there was no strategic reason to do it. They fed us because that's who they are." He saw the disbelief, the suspicion, the inability to reconcile what he was saying with what they'd been taught, with what they'd believed, but he kept talking because the truth mattered, because the contrast mattered, because understanding why they'd lost mattered. "They won because they were better than us," he said. "Not better soldiers, better people. They maintained their humanity when we lost ours. That's why they won. That's why we deserve to lose." The words were heresy, even now, even in defeat. Saying Germany deserved to lose, saying the enemy was better. But Leopold said them anyway. Because they were true, because someone needed to say them, because the next generation needed to hear them so they didn't make the same mistakes. The years passed. Germany rebuilt itself. Slowly, painfully. The hunger eased, not quickly, not easily, but eventually Leopold found work, raised a family. His children were born into a new Germany, a democratic Germany, a Germany that had rejected its totalitarian past, or was trying to. In the 1960s, when his children were old enough to ask questions, they asked. "Papa," his daughter said one evening, she was 14, smart, curious, born into peace and unable to imagine what war had been like. "You were a prisoner?" "Yes." "Were they cruel to you?" Leopold thought about how to answer, how to explain something that still seemed impossible, even to him. "No," he said finally. "They weren't cruel, they were kind." "Kind? But you were enemies." "We were, but they understood something we didn't. They understood that enemies are still human beings, that how you treat people says more about you than it does about them." He told them about the first meal, about 23 starving men sitting in silence, about the door opening, about the smell of real food, about tears falling while eating, about the impossibility of believing it could continue, about how it continued anyway. "They fed us," he said, "like we mattered, like our hunger mattered, like we deserved dignity, even though we'd fought against them for years. His son, 12, frowned. But why? Because they believed all humans have value. Not because we earned it, not because we deserved it, but because we were human, and that was enough. His daughter was quiet for a long moment. "Did it change you?" she asked. "Yes," Leopold said. "Completely. I went into that camp believing strength was cruelty. I came out understanding that real strength is kindness. Real power is choosing to be better than your enemies. Choosing to maintain your values when it would be easier not to." He looked at his children, at these young faces that had never known hunger, never known war, never known what it meant to be defeated and expecting death and receiving mercy instead. "The Canadians taught me that," he said, "by feeding me when I was starving, by treating me like a human being when they had every right to treat me like an enemy, by being better people than I'd been taught they were." "Were they better than us?" his son asked. The question hung in the air, dangerous, complicated. "They were better than what we'd become," Leopold said carefully. "They showed me what we could have been, what we should have been, what I hope we're trying to be now." That night, after his children had gone to bed, Leopold sat alone in his kitchen. In an apartment that had furniture again, that had electricity and heat and food in the cupboards. In a Germany that was rebuilding, that was trying to become something different. He thought about Fraser, wondered if he was still alive, wondered if he knew how much that conversation in the garden had mattered, how much the consistent daily provision of food had changed, not just Leopold's body but his mind, his soul. He thought about that first meal, 22 years ago now, but still vivid, still powerful, the smell of real meat, the taste of seasoned food, the tears that had fallen, the world that had cracked open. He understood now what had really happened in that room. It wasn't just about food. It had never been just about food. It was about the message, the statement, the proof. Every meal had said, "You are worth feeding. You matter. Your humanity hasn't been revoked by your defeat. You are still a person deserving of dignity." And that message, delivered 3 times a day for 2 years, had broken through propaganda and ideology and certainty in a way that arguments never could have. In a way that punishment never could have. The Canadians had won his mind by feeding his body, had changed his beliefs by showing him what their beliefs looked like in practice. They had defeated him more thoroughly with kindness than they ever could have with cruelty. Leopold stood, walked to his cupboard, took out a plate, a single empty plate. He held it in his hands. This ordinary object, this simple thing. Once it would have represented starvation, emptiness, the absence of what he needed to survive. Now it represented transformation, the space where cruelty could have lived, but kindness chose to dwell instead, the place where enemies became humans again. He set the plate on the table, stared at it. "Thank you," he said quietly to a man thousands of miles away who couldn't hear him, to a corporal who'd probably forgotten the name of one prisoner among thousands, to soldiers who'd just been doing their jobs but had changed a life anyway. "Thank you for feeding me, for treating me like I mattered, for showing me what strength really looks like, for giving me something to tell my children that might help them understand what we should never become again." The plate sat empty on the table, but Leopold understood now that emptiness could be a good thing, a space for possibility, a space for change. He'd entered that room 22 years ago as Sergeant Leopold Adler of the Wehrmacht, a soldier of the Reich, a man who believed in all the wrong things. He'd left it learning to be human again, all because someone had fed him when he was starving, all because someone had chosen kindness over cruelty, all because someone had understood that how you treat your defeated enemies is the measure of who you really are. And that one meal, that first impossible meal, had taught him more about strength and humanity and civilization than all the years of war that came before it. Leopold Adler lived to 87 years old. He died in 1997, in a Germany that was united again, democratic, peaceful, part of a community of nations that had chosen cooperation over conquest. On his deathbed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd never known hunger, never known war, he told the story one last time, about 23 men in a room, about a door opening, about food that shouldn't have existed, about tears that fell, about a corporal with kind eyes who showed him what civilization really meant. "Never forget," he whispered to them, "how we treat our enemies when we have the power to destroy them. That's who we really are. That's the only measure that matters." His last words were simple. "I never forgot that meal." And then he was gone. But the story remained, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can persist. That kindness can be stronger than cruelty. That feeding your enemies when they're starving isn't weakness. It's the truest form of strength there is. Leopold Adler